If you casually express an opinion within 2 football fields of an asylum centre, that could soon be a crime in Ireland under a newly proposed law. This is Ben Scallan and you're watching Gript Media. Before we start the video, if you want to support Gript and our work, make sure to click like, subscribe and comment, because by liking, commenting and sharing, this channel will get boosted in the algorithm and get seen by more people. So if you want to see this channel grow, just take 2 seconds right now to like, comment and do your part to support independent journalism. And so with that said, on to the video. The Irish government is currently looking to pass a bill which would ban protests outside of asylum centres like the ones at East Wall, and you don't have to take my word for that because Fianna Fáil Senator Malcolm Byrne has told us as much explicitly. As the senator said in a statement earlier this month, the Protection of Private Residences Against Targeted Picketing Bill 2021 is designed to ban protests against individuals outside of where they live. We need the legislation to protect homes. That applies to the temporary homes of those seeking refuge as much as to elected representatives. This legislation, which the government is apparently working fast to get signed into law, would effectively ban peaceful protests across Ireland like the ones in areas like East Wall, and has gone completely unscrutinised by most of the Irish media to date. According to the bill, those in breach of the proposed law would face a Class D fine which could be up to €1,000, a year in prison or both. And virtually nobody is talking about it for some reason. Now, before we get too negative, I must say that in fairness, it's not all bad news. You'll still be allowed to protest in a few locations that the government has deemed acceptable. As Byrne said in the statement, if anyone is unhappy with the government policy, they can protest outside Leinster House, outside government departments or agencies, or outside elected representatives' offices. Wow, how generous, eh? What would we do without them? And so, in light of all this, I went down to Leinster House to interview the senator last week on his bill in some depth. The list of quote-unquote acceptable places to protest seems to be getting smaller and smaller. How can you have a free democracy when the government can say how you're allowed to protest and the way in which you should conduct your protest? Does that not seem grossly inappropriate?
Well, I mean, if you read the bill, I mean, what the bill provides for is around an individual's private residence. I'm aware that there are other issues.
But that would include asylum centres.
In other
which might be in a person's neighbourhood. Like if somebody lives in East Wall, for example, that they could be protesting on their own street and it might be outside somebody's residence.
But who made the decision with regard to East Wall to look at housing people in East Wall? It wasn't those who were seeking asylum or refuge who were there.
If you'd like to watch that full 8-minute long interview, you can do so by looking up this video on gript.ie or on most social media websites like YouTube and Facebook. But regardless, at this point it's worth taking a moment to take a look at the actual wording of the proposed bill's text to find out what a protest means in this context. Because after all, how do you define a protest legally? The law is all about defining terms, so does one person silently holding a sign outside an asylum centre constitute a protest? Is 2 people handing out leaflets nearby a protest? The answer is not always obvious. So how does this bill attempt to define it? Well, as broadly as possible, it turns out. According to this bill's wording, a protest includes, but is not limited to seek to influence, to interfere with, whatever that means, or to advise and or persuade, attempt to advise and or persuade, or otherwise express an opinion. The most remarkable part of that is easily the last bit, which claims that a protest includes expressing an opinion. And bear in mind that the bill later says that this includes formally or informally engaging in these activities within 200 meters of a residential dwelling, including an asylum centre. So for a visualization of the range we're talking about here, 200 meters is about 2 football pitches long end to end. So adding all of this together, it seems like if you informally express an opinion within 2 football fields of an asylum centre, that may be construed as a violation of this proposed law as it's currently laid out. If you're several streets away from the ESB building in East Wall and you hand someone a pamphlet explaining why you think it's bad for the community, you could be guilty of an offence if this comes into force. Does that sound reasonable to anyone? Well, it apparently doesn't sound reasonable to Garda Commissioner Drew Harris, who seemed to gently voice his opposition to this idea on RTE last week.
There's been a suggestion for exclusion zones around refugee accommodation. Would you support that? Could that be policed?
Well, I think I would say in respect of the protests that have occurred, when we are in contact with those who are within the various shelters, they're confident in terms of the policing presence of Garda Síochána, the way these protests are policed, and actually feel that we're providing a good service. The other hand, we are in an open democratic society. Protest is part of being in that society, and so we have to facilitate those protests as long as they remain within the law. And that law change then, the suggestion then, I think that would be one we need to consider very carefully, because I do think in terms of protest and an open society, protest does allow feelings to be vent and actually then matters to be brought to public attention and dealt with.
In other words, the asylum seekers feel safe, people have a right to protest, and the new law isn't necessary, which stands to reason considering the fact that Ireland has had laws about harassment and threats and public order for years now. Anything else would be totally superfluous. And so it's in this context that I decided to interview the senator in Leinster House last week to question him on the proposed law and its potential consequences. And the answers I got were not very satisfactory, to say the least. For example, during the course of our interview, the senator repeatedly said that if protesters want to object to government policy, they can do so outside of government buildings like the Department of Justice or Leinster House.
If you disagree with the government's immigration policy, protest outside Leinster House, protest outside the Department of Justice, where the decisions are being made. And if you have a disagreement with the government's immigration policy, you can protest outside the Department of Justice. There is no restriction on protesting outside the Department of Justice or outside Leinster House.
What this fails to address, however, is the fact that this leaves rural people up a creek without a paddle, because if the people of Tipperary or Kerry want to protest against the government's immigration policy, for example, why should they have to drag themselves all the way up to Dublin, hundreds of kilometres, to do so? One might say, well, sure, they don't have to come up to Dublin, they can just protest outside the local council. But as we know from instances like the asylum centre in Kinnegad, the Department of Integration often railroads asylum centres into towns and villages without even consulting with local councils.
One of the things that was said during the meeting was that it's kind of standard procedure for direct provision centres to be placed in areas without consulting the county council. Do you think that that's kind of an appropriate way to go about it?
No, I'm a county councillor myself, and I brought it up at today's meeting saying that we cannot allow a situation where the council, who are in charge of housing, planning, provision for people coming into the country from abroad, Ukrainian situation, the whole lot, why were they bypassed when they're already doing such a wonderful job and they have the expertise on site to deal with it? They should be consulted in the first instance.
So local authorities have little to no say in what is happening at the national level, and they are routinely overruled by government departments in Dublin. So protesting against your local councillor probably doesn't make sense. Councillors aren't driving this, and they can't affect it one way or the other. At this point, somebody might say, okay, so protest on the main road in your town or village and make your voice heard that way. But it turns out that Senator Malcolm Byrne doesn't support that either. As he said in our interview last week,
I don't believe that, for instance, that you should be obstructing people on their way into work when you are protesting.
It's notable, by the way, that this would of course include tractor protests by farmers, which rural communities sometimes engage in to get their point across when the cities aren't listening, and also hauliers and truckers who occasionally use this method of protest as well. So in short, you can't protest outside the asylum centre, you can't protest on the main road or anywhere that might disrupt traffic, it's pointless to protest your local councillor who has no power to change anything, and so your only option is to wait until the weekend when you've got no work and then try to convince your neighbours to drive hundreds of kilometres down to Dublin to stand around outside an empty Leinster House screaming into thin air because all the politicians are at home in their socks watching a match. Does that sound effective to you? Because that will be the future of protests for rural people if this law comes into force. If one didn't know better, they might suspect that the government knows this would be completely ineffective and impotent, and that's exactly why they want people to do it. Some people might argue that the success of protests like East Wall and the fact that the demonstrations have widespread support is the actual problem that the government is concerned about here. Far be it from me to accuse the government of having ulterior motives, but this proposed exclusion zone is not the first time they've attempted to ban a kind of peaceful demonstration. The same government is also attempting to ban prayer near to abortion clinics, even silent prayer that's not bothering anybody. If your granny is quietly thumbing through her rosary beads at the end of the road where abortions are performed, she could get done for a criminal offence under these plans, despite the fact that the Gardaí themselves have confirmed that any demonstrations outside such clinics have been entirely legal and peaceful, and that exclusion zones aren't needed as the current public order legislation is sufficient. And yet the government is driving ahead with this anyway, against the advice of the police. Furthermore, we can't forget that this is the same government that banned peaceful protests for years at a time during the lockdown. They're even attempting to ram through subjective so-called hate speech laws, where anything you say that they deem to be hateful could land you on the receiving end of a criminal sentence. The list goes on and on. You know, in life we sometimes encounter things that seem perfectly innocent and unassuming at first, until you step back and view them in a wider context. If a man approached you on the street and asked if he could use your phone to make a quick emergency call because he had lost his own mobile, most people would say that that sounds reasonable and would try to help a stranger in need. However, if at that point a passerby informed you that this man was a locally notorious thief who routinely got his hands on strangers' phones and then bolted, that would probably put a different complexion on the whole situation. Taken in isolation, it seems harmless, but in context, you realize it's anything but. And when it comes to this bill, the context seems to be an increasingly authoritarian government which is seeking more and more to restrict the times, places, and methods of protest and how the Irish public are allowed to express themselves. To put it bluntly, this bill is dangerous and no civic-minded person in Ireland should tolerate it. Please like and share this video, and if you enjoyed it, please consider signing up for a monthly donation via the link on screen to help us produce more content like this. Alternative media like Gript needs all the assistance it can get, and every donation goes a long way. As always, thanks for watching.